Inside of a camera, there is a light-sensitive device. In film cameras, it's literally the film. And in modern cameras, it's a digital sensor that is light-sensitive. The lens on the front of the camera directs light into the body of the camera in such a way that it hits that light-sensitive material, which then processes and stores that data. In film cameras, I still don't get it. It's crazy. But basically, there's some sort of chemical reaction that happens in film when light hits it that makes it hold a photo somehow. And even by seemingly more magic, these digital sensors somehow grab that information and hold on to it magnetically. Sorry, microphone. That's about all the science that I really understand. I just know what I need to do to get what I want out of it. So that's what I'm going to teach you. I'm going to teach you all of the settings and all of the mechanical parts surrounding the camera that a cinematographer can have control of, and the terms that you're going to need to know as an editor to have an intelligent conversation with a cinematographer about the shots that were taken. Focal length is literally the length of your lens. It is measured in millimeters. The very shortest lenses, which are only a few millimeters long, create what's called a fisheye lens. It stretches and warps the shape of the image in order to fit into a little box. This is not happening in the camera. This is an effect of the length of the lens. The glass inside of the lens is essentially warping the light before it hits the sensor in the camera. The opposite is true of a telephoto lens. When you have a lens that is hundreds of millimeters long, it creates a very, very narrow tube that can focus on a very small subject very far away. I mean, if you get long enough with a telephoto lens, you've essentially created a telescope. That's all a long lens is. It's a telescope. We've taken your binoculars and we've put them onto an image capturing device. Focal length is interesting because of the way that different lenses look. Like I said, the lenses are essentially distorting the image. And so objects look different at different focal lengths. At short focal lengths, faces look extremely narrow. At long focal lengths, faces look extremely wide. At short focal lengths, everything looks very deep. At long focal lengths, everything looks very shallow. Long focal lengths basically compress the foreground and the background. Everything sort of starts getting packed together really tightly. Wide focal lengths, there's a big difference between the foreground and the background. Now, cameras can be a little bit confusing because there are multiple settings that, when you don't understand cameras, feel like they do the same thing. So I'm going to explain the separate mechanisms on the camera and what they're doing mechanically, and then explain how they're going to affect your image. ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor. If you have a higher ISO, then your sensor will be more sensitive to light. So if it's really dark outside, you're going to want to have a high ISO because that will be more sensitive to light. If it's really, really bright outside, you're going to want to have a low ISO because you can still see clearly without your sensor being as sensitive. So I'm going to explain this one with film first because it makes more sense. In a film camera, shutter speed was the amount of time that the shutter would be open and expose your film to light before it closed and then moved to the next image in the film reel. Now, this is a little confusing because it's not how fast the film is moving. It's not the pictures per second. It's not the frames per second. It's the amount of time that each frame is exposed. Let's say that we're set to film at 24 frames a second. So we're going to have 24 frames play back every second. So for 1/24th of a second, our frame will be ready to be exposed to light. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it will be exposed for a full 24th of a second. You can have that shutter open and close much faster than that, in which case you only let in a tiny bit of light. You could have your shutter open and close in 1/1000th of a second. The shutter speed is how long your individual frame will be exposed to light. So this individual frame will play back for 1/24th of a second in the context of the whole video. But when we're considering just this one frame, we can expose it to more or less light. We could expose it to a full 1/24th of a second of light, or we could expose it to the light for only 1/5000th of a second. So the shutter speed is how long the frame is exposed to light. And that can be a lot shorter than the full time it will be playing back. Now, really fast shutter speeds, like 1/10,000th of a second, will get you really, really sharp, clear images. Professional sports photographers typically use a shutter speed of 1/1000th of a second because it will make sure that the images are crisp. If you expose for longer than that, say 1/30th of a second, you will get more light and therefore more information, but you're also susceptible to extra motion blur. Motion blur occurs when your subject moves during the length of time that your frame is exposed, therefore creating sort of multiple indents of their shape on the same frame. You'll notice this most drastically in long exposure photography where people will write out words using a single firework. That's possible because you leave the shutter open for so long that the photosensitive light is getting exposed to that light on the same frame in multiple locations. So, fast shutter speed equals clearer images and less motion blur, but also less light. Slower shutter speed means more light, but also more motion blur. On the back of all professional lenses, there is a little mechanism that can open and close. It's called an iris, and it's there to stop the amount of light that gets sent to the back of the camera. If that iris is wide, it will let in tons of light. If that iris is closed down, it will let in just a little bit of light. The aperture is the f-stop measurement, and the f-stop measurement is determined by the size of the iris. So small number means wide open iris. Big number means closed off iris. Now, aperture affects two things. It affects your exposure and it affects your depth of field. Exposure is the overall brightness of your image. We've talked about how your shutter speed can affect it. We've talked about how the aperture can affect it. We've talked about how the ISO can affect it. Your overall image exposure is going to basically be a summary of all of these things combined. Now, I mentioned depth of field and how aperture affects it. Let's talk about that one. Depth of field is the amount of the image this way, depth-wise, that your camera can focus on. Now, this is another place where something like sports or reality TV tends to be very different than cinema and film. In film, they like to control the eye. They're handling it like an art form. And so parts of the image being out of focus and fuzzy help control where the eye looks and create a visual aesthetic. Whereas sports need to make sure that their image is as clear as possible. They don't want anything fuzzy. So depth of field is the term that we've given this phenomenon of your camera having a very shallow or very broad ability of seeing things as sharp or blurry. How much can it focus on? A very shallow depth of field may be only a few centimeters or millimeters across. Only a very specific plane in the focal plane will be in focus. A wide depth of field means that dozens or hundreds of feet in front of the camera can all be sharp at the same time. Low aperture equals shallow depth of field. High aperture equals wide depth of field. So if you're shooting sports, you want a really closed down aperture so that you can have a wide depth of field. Okay, so frames per second. I have mentioned this a lot. We need to talk about it. And I know that you already get the gist of it, but frames per second is how many pictures we record and play back every second. And it really is basically that straightforward. Most cinema films at 24 frames a second. Most TV and sports films at 30 frames a second. Most video games play at 60 frames a second. Where this gets more complicated is when you start dealing with slow motion and fast motion. Slow motion and fast motion is determined by how many frames a second were recorded and then how many frames a second are playing back. If the frames per second recorded is higher than the playback frames per second, it will be slow motion. If the frames per second recorded is lower than the playback frames per second, it will be fast motion. Some simple examples of this to make it sound less academic. If I take one picture every second for 24 seconds, that's almost half a minute of time. But if I play those back at 24 frames a second, then I see all 24 frames in 1 second. So we went from half a minute to 1 second. So that's fast motion. That's a time lapse. If I shoot 1,000 frames a second and then I play back only 24 of those frames every second, then it's going to take me way longer to play back the full clip, which means that we've just created slow motion. So time-lapse photographers will take a new photo every second or every minute, or sometimes even as infrequently as once a day. And then they'll play those all back at a normal frames per second rate, and it will create a time lapse where we can see things that usually go very slow quickly evolving. This is the technique behind videos that show plants grow. On the flip side, slow motion cameras capture hundreds of thousands of frames every second, and therefore can play back stuff at incredibly slow speeds. You already understand this if you watch the slow-mo guys. White balance and color temperature. For any of you more artistically minded, you might already know this, but this took me well into my 20s to finally realize. Different light has different colors. I mean, obviously, I have pink and green lights behind me, but this light right here is much more blue than the lamps that we have downstairs. Most white light is not truly white. It leans blue or leans orange. Blue is cool, orange is warm. So it's kind of weird. You have to basically tell your camera what the color of white looks like, because white looks different under different light. So if you're outside under the sun, which light is pretty blue, then you need to tell your camera to be looking at blues as white, and this creates a correct color balance. If you take that same setting of the color of the sun and you go under like indoor lamps, they will look extremely orange and it'll be kind of off-putting and ugly. So typically you're going to want to tell your camera to, again, change its color temperature balance to look for white in the oranges so that everything can look correct. Now, our eyes can obviously differentiate the difference between the blues and the oranges, but they can also adjust accordingly and understand both correctly. Cameras are dumb and don't understand as well. So my big softbox lights that I have for this studio are 5600 Kelvin balanced, which means that they are the same color roughly as the sun. So if I open my window, it'll still look fine. But if I were to pull a lamp and put it next to my face, it would be extremely orange. So let's now think through this a little bit. We are a sports camera operator. Well, first of all, we need our audience to clearly understand exactly what the athletes are doing. The athletes are moving at high speeds. The athletes are moving a lot. We can't really afford for their movements to get blurred, which means that we need to avoid motion blur, which means that we need a really fast shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is going to lower our exposure, so we need to keep that in mind. Also, the athletes are going to be moving back and forth on the field a lot, and I, as a camera operator on the end of the field, am not going to have time to think about pulling focus, making sure that the athletes are always in focus. Often, there may be a play that I won't even be focused on that could happen somewhere in the background, and they're going to need to use my camera for a replay because it happened to be the best shot on accident, which means that I need everything in focus all the time, which means I need a very high aperture or a tight iris. This is also going to lower my exposure. So because I have to make those considerations for the sporting aspect, I'm going to need to compensate in my exposure by probably raising my ISO. I may have to raise my ISO quite a bit, and this is why most sports are filmed with extremely large, expensive cameras, because they have to have the capability of doing all of this, especially because a telephoto lens is going to cut down on even more light. The longer the lens, the less light can get all the way through that lens. So the longer the lens, the less light it will let in. Okay, so now I'm a director of photography on a short film with a very, very intimate, emotional scene. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be very artistically aesthetic and visually interesting. Well, I would like to have some sparkling lights in the background out of focus, and I would like to really focus on the beautiful eyes of my actor. So I'm going to have my aperture all the way open, so my number is going to go as low as it possibly can. A little bit of motion blur is okay. I'm going for a very cinematic look here. So I'm going to have an average shutter speed and an average frames per second. You start to see how whatever your priorities are can then kind of chain react to the other camera settings. That is how cameras work.